Hi everyone, this is Nia, and today I'm going to be painting this underwater scene. I'm going to be using a few simple steps, but before we begin to paint, like usual, I'm just going to draw out the main features of this painting so it's easier to visualize. So the two main features here are probably the surface pattern and the top, and I'm going to begin by creating the pattern at the bottom. I'm basically trying to create a 2-point perspective grid, so I'm imagining a point that I'm meeting outside of the frame on both sides, and as I get further away, the lines become smaller and closer together, and this will create the illusion that the surface is further away and moving into the vanishing point. This doesn't have to be accurate. In fact, I like to actually intentionally create wavy lines to depict the uneven surface of the sand underwater, and you'll notice that the lines will create a distorted square or sort of like a play card diamond shape. So for the top section, I'm just going to create a similar pattern but in a looser form to suggest the wavy water above, but I just flattened and enlarged the shape a bit more, and I tried to paint the shapes in between the previous ones and getting smaller and thinner as I get towards the bottom so it looks further away. So those are basically the main features for this painting, but going back to the bottom, though we're going to use the squares as guidelines, I tried to make them less grid-like by drawing individual shapes following the grid, which can be a bit more oval so it looks more like water surface that is flowing instead of something that's geometric. Once I've prepped my paper, I'm just going to be masking the water area first, which is the surface pattern that we drew out earlier. I'm going to be using this masking fluid pen by Pebeo. With this masking fluid, you would have to press the nib down quite hard to get the masking fluid out. And someone in the comment section mentioned to me before that they end up damaging and ripping the paper when you try to rub off the masking fluid. This also happened to me the first time I used it, but I found that by extracting the fluid on scrap paper first, it solves this problem really well, so you don't have to press down with a hard nib on the paper that you're working on. So I'm just going to have the scrap paper right next to me so I can extract the masking fluid whenever I need to. I just really like how much control you get using this masking fluid pen. As you can see, I can get really fine lines using it, but the downside of this is that the nib gets congested with dried up masking fluid if you don't use it for a while or clean it, so just be mindful of that if you decide to get it yourself. Or you can also use any other masking fluid that you're used to, or if you don't have masking fluid, it's also doable to use the sparkly shoreline technique for this painting, but it may come out a bit different, and of course it'll take way longer to create. So once I created the grid, I'm just drawing out the individual shapes or just trying to break these squares a bit more like how I drew it out before in pencil. Don't be scared to do this, because even if we make mistakes now, once we take off the masking fluid, we're still going to be painting on it, so you can just add more layers of paint to fix any mistakes later on. I also add these long wavy lines from one end to the other. These are parts that I'm going to lighten with white gouache to give it a bit of light reflection from the surface. I want the masking fluid to be completely dry, so I'm going to use a hairdryer to speed up the process, and meanwhile let me go over the colors that I'm going to use. So firstly at the top I have Phthalo Turquoise, then Prussian Blue, Moon Glow, and Yellow Ochre. Okay, so once everything is dry, before I put down the paint, I'm just going to wet the paper evenly. You can use any large brush for this, and you just want a light and even distribution of clean water. I'm going to start out with Phthalo Turquoise, and for this I made a little section of a circle that I'm going to leave out because I want it to be completely white. And for the rest, I just continued with the pattern that I drew out earlier, but because the surface is wet, it is going to mostly blend together. I just use this as sort of practice to get the motion of the shapes down. Then for the top section, I end up taking off some of the paint to lengthen the shape and create more of a wavy or watery texture using just my dry brush to pick up the excess paint. Moving forward to the midsection of the painting now, I'm going to get a thick consistency Prussian blue and paint this until it reaches the top section of the surface. Then I'm going to continue again with the Phthalo Turquoise to paint the top and the bottom section of the surface. And in the midsection of the pattern, I'm going to be using yellow ochre, and I'm just going to move the paint around until it creates a soft transition from the Phthalo Turquoise to the yellow ochre in the middle. Now that the paints have settled, you can see that the top section has mostly blended together. So I'm going to add more of the turquoise to repaint the pattern, and I'm also going to help take some of the paint off using a bit of rolled up tissue, and then going back and forth with the tissue and the paint to get the placement that I'm looking for. A tip when you're lifting color with the tissue is to not repeatedly put too much pressure so you don't end up damaging or scraping the paper, so just be gentle when you're lifting. From the camera, I don't think you can see the difference in color, but the Phthalo Turquoise is actually a bit more green than the Prussian blue, so it has more of a refreshing feeling in my opinion. But if you don't have the color, you can also just use Prussian blue and use a thinner consistency for the top section and a thicker consistency for the midsection, and just play with the values. Anyway, moving on to the darker section on the middle of the painting, I'm going to help darken it by using Moon Glow. You can also use black to darken it, but Moon Glow has a slight purple shade that I really like. But again, these are just very subtle changes, so you can always substitute the color whenever you need to. And for an additional tip here, for the connection between the top surface and the midsection, I like to create a slight curve, and I feel like this gives more of an interesting sense of perspective to the painting. And from here, my paper was very wet, so I don't think it'll take any more paint, so I just dry it off using a hairdryer to speed up the process. As the paint dries off, you can see how pale the color has become, and I'm just going to continue to layer on more vibrant colors using a thick consistency Prussian blue with Moon Glow to just further darken that area, just creating curved strokes to enhance the shape of the top and the bottom portion of the water to create the perspective that I mentioned before. As I move towards the top section, I start to create the wavy texture, and just like how I drew it out before, I started with wavy lines closer together at the bottom. Then as I get towards the top section, the gap and the shapes become larger as more light starts to peek through. And from here on, I'm just going to basically continue to layer on the colors the same way as I did for the previous layers, just to keep building up the vibrancy of the colors. Whenever the paper is fairly wet, there comes a point where it won't take any more paint. So when this happens, just dry it off with the hairdryer and keep adding on the colors until it reaches the vibrancy that you're looking for. Here I'm going to use a medium consistency Prussian blue to enhance the shape of the waves. I only want subtle textures in order to keep the glowing effect from the soft transition in the previous layer, and I'm just painting the sides upwards to give the slight curve. After this, I'm going to take off the masking fluid, and it's very important to make sure that your paper is completely bone dry, not to even be cold to the touch, because if the paper is wet, it is a bit weaker, and if you try to take off the masking fluid while the paper is the slightest bit wet, it is at a higher risk of being damaged. From here, you'll see that the white is very bright compared to the rest of the painting, but I'm just going to do a slight glaze over the pattern. I'm going to use the same color as the surface, so phthalo turquoise with a bit of yellow ochre in the middle, and I'm just doing this very lightly and drying it along the way to make sure that I don't go too dark. In my sparkly shoreline tutorial, people mentioned that the glazing disrupts the previous layer. I'm using a very soft brush here, so that's probably why the surface is fine. But if you're using a synthetic, try to be gentle and maybe try it out on a small section first at the edge to see how the paint reacts and if it does smudge or not. And if it does end up smudging, then try to just go around the white areas very lightly, avoiding the painted areas from the previous layer. For the pattern at the back, I'm going to paint inside the shapes using Prussian blue, and I'm going to use a thinner consistency as I get towards the midsection of the pattern and then just stop there. So this makes the weight of the outline at the back become slightly lighter. Next, I'm going to take out my white gouache. I'm using Zinc white, which is the least opaque of all the whites, and I'm purposefully using this because I only want to glaze on certain parts of the outline from the masked lines. This is to create different light reflections and will help with the glowing effect that I'm starting to build. I like to just make the lines run across the page, and this is to essentially soften or blur out the whites together. At the same time, I want to make this less flat, so I am going to bring in a light consistency of either the Prussian blue or phthalo turquoise to add in small details to enhance those lines. Then I'm going to get my white jelly roll pen to draw more at the top. I like to place more white where the shapes are connected. Then I'm going to also soften these lines with a damp brush. This pen is water soluble, so you can treat it like white gouache and activate it with water and just rub it with your brush to soften the edges. Going a bit off topic here, I have to apologize for the condition of my hands here. I had a really bad flare-up due to an infection and my skin reacted really badly, and I feel like it'll be like this for a while because the lesions are quite thick. But just watching back while I edit this makes me cringe a bit. But I just hope that the gross wounds and the lesions are not too distracting to the painting, so I hope you guys are still enjoying this tutorial. So going back to the tutorial, here I also like to add random lines through the middle of the shapes, as well as create oval looking shapes for each of the square to cut the grid or get rid of the squarish look. Moving on to the glow at the top, for this I'm going to start to map out the lines by using white gouache. This is just to help me with the placement so I have a better visualization of it. And once I'm done, I'm going to actually lift the color using a wet brush, just rubbing the paint off using a clean damp brush and dabbing the activated paint on paper with tissue to take off the wet paint. And I'm just going to basically keep repeating this until I lighten all of the lines. Next, I'm going to create smaller, thinner lines in between the larger ones to vary the size of the light rays. You can map this out with white gouache first, like before, but here I felt comfortable enough already because I'm just going to use the lines that I already have on the sides as guide, so I'm just going to repeat the same process. Going back to the white gouache, I'm going to add more white to the top of the glow to make the area look more blown out and overexposed, just slowly building it up and softening the bottom to create a soft transition. With the white gouache, I'm also going to add small wavy textures for the waves as extra highlight, and because I'm using zinc white, the white will dry off a bit more transparent and it won't look too harsh. For the bottom, I like to extend the light rays so it reaches different lengths, and this will create the illusion of depth as the light reaches different positions on the surface of the sea. As the final detail, I'm going to add bubbles. I'm going to vary this by drawing out circles as well as tiny dots for the smaller ones, and I'm going to place them from the bottom floating upwards and also where the glow is. And then at the end, I'm also going to add splatters with the white gouache. For this, you can paint it on using either the white gouache or the white jelly roll pen. I personally like to switch between both because I like having different opacities for the white to add more depth to the painting. If you prefer the control of using the pen, you can also do that and then soften it with a damp brush, and you can create a lighter or more transparent white that way. Once you're done, make sure to take a good look at it to see if you want to make final adjustments. Sometimes I find it hard to see when the painting is still masked, so in this case I took it off and I just had a look at the final result. I feel like I can soften the whites further with my brush and then adding additional white right at the center of those connections, so the lines on the light reflections are not as harsh. So that's pretty much it for this painting. I find this one so relaxing to paint, and I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be listed in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!